Hey everyone, welcome back to RetroBreak and welcome to another physical tier list. That's right, I've got a bunch of games in front of me, I've got the table right here, and today we're going to be taking a look at my thoughts about the entire 3D Mario series, starting off with Super Mario 64. A game that came out when I was only about 4 years old, so I don't have that many memories of actually playing this when it was new, but I do know that I really enjoyed it at the time, and I did get all of the stars as a kid as well. Here's my original copy of Mario 64, and there's something inside that I wanted to show you that's really exciting and a really cool piece for my personal collection. I actually got it signed by Charles Martinet, so if you can see on there, he wrote a whole bunch of gibberish Mario quotes and signed it at the bottom, so I'm so happy to actually have this. I got this from when he came to visit Game in Birmingham for some reason, so I was so happy to have that. And another really nice memory I have from this game was actually looking through the instruction manual as a kid. I just loved all of these images with all of the different moves that Mario could pull off, and I even remember like rewriting and drawing the characters from the start of this instruction book. I was just completely engrossed with the whole Mario world at the time, and it really does hold a lot of very fond memories for me personally. So although it hasn't quite aged as well as some of the other games in the 3D Mario series, I have to give this one, my personal ranking, a very strong A rank. There we go, added to the tier list. And just for fun, I've also got the Japanese box here as well. Just look how nice the box art is for the Japanese version. And on the back too, it just looks so cool. So again, I'm going to put this one in the A rank. There's something a little bit different about this version actually, and that's the fact that it also supports the rumble feature, which the original one didn't. So that's a really cool little addition to this. And this is actually the one that the Switch game is based on. So that famous quote that Bowser says that everyone misinterprets, it's actually missing from this version of the game as well. So again, another one for the A rank, and now we're moving on to the second game in the 3D Mario series, which is Super Mario Sunshine for the GameCube. And this was actually the first Mario game that I actually picked up on day one. This came out in 2002, I believe, and this was actually the first time in the Mario series where I'd actually been looking forward to the release of the game as well, thanks to things like gaming magazines and some early internet as well. I actually remember seeing the original trailer that was shown off at Space World a few years earlier, with loads of things that didn't make it into the final game, like that weird big blob with giant legs that stomps across the ground and chases after Mario, and I was also obsessed with all of the little details that changed between then and the final release, like the different design of FLUDD. He used to have a very short, thin nozzle, but in the end game it sort of sprouts out into this big nozzle, and he obviously talks like that using it. There's just so many really interesting differences as well with the UI and the original level design compared to how it was in the final game, and when this came out I just absolutely fell in love with it. It quickly became my favourite game in the Mario series, full stop, especially the GameCube version. Obviously it's been re-released on the Switch since then, but the GameCube version, in my opinion, still plays the best. I think it took full advantage of the GameCube controller. I've actually got a GameCube controller right here, so I can show you what I mean, and for those of you that have only played the Switch version, you wouldn't actually know this, but on the original, you see how the GameCube triggers have a sort of squeeze on them before it fully clicks down? Well, that actually controls FLUDD in the game, so if you only press it down slightly, Mario can actually still run around, and then when you hold it down completely, then he stops in place and then you can actually aim up and down. And it made perfect sense on this controller, but with the Switch they actually switched it to the two trigger buttons, which didn't feel quite as nice, so I think playing it using the GameCube controller just feels absolutely fantastic. And I loved all of the additional FLUDD moves and things as well. But there were a few things that I didn't like quite as much as the original. I'm sure a lot of you know that Sunshine can be quite frustrating to play, but even so, I 100% completed this just like the first game. In fact, I know this video is probably going to drag on because I've got so many memories about all of these games, but another thing that I really enjoy thinking about when I think back on Mario Sunshine is the fact that my mum used to sit with me at night with the big thick primer game strategy guide, and she would go through all of the blue coin locations, and I would be playing through the game and she would be telling me where I needed to go in order to collect them all. And I'm sure for some of you who are watching, you know how much of a pain it is to track down all them blue coins. So that's a really fond memory, and it's probably the only way that I was actually managed to 100% complete this. So again, Mario Sunshine is going in the A rank, I think. And yeah, I think a lot of the games are going to be in either A or S because I just love the Mario series so much. Now we're moving on to the next game, which came out in 2005 in the UK, I believe, and this was a launch title for the original Nintendo DS. This is Super Mario 64 DS. Again, another game that I was very much looking forward to before the release of the game as well. And something else that I was also tracking in magazines and on the internet. And before it was called Mario 64 DS, it was actually called Mario 64 x 4, and it was going to have a lot more emphasis on the multiplayer aspect. But they basically stripped all of that out and relegated it to its own separate mode in the final game. But I loved what was here. I know a lot of people complain about the controls, but I didn't really have a problem with them at the time, and I actually quite liked the inclusion of having a separate run button rather than using the analog stick, so maybe I was just a weird kid and I was just super excited about the idea of a fully 3D Mario game on a handheld, that these sort of quirks about the DS version didn't really bother me at all. And I also loved all of the mini-games that used the touchscreen and stuff as well, although when I go back to play Mario 64 today, I hardly ever go back and re-experience the DS version, because the N64 one is just superior in most regards. It looks better, it plays better, it's a bit more streamlined. The DS one had a weird thing where you would introduce to all these other Mario characters throughout the adventure, and I didn't really like how they integrated that with the original game so much, so I'm actually going to give Mario 64 DS a B rank. And now for probably one of my most anticipated games of all time. Again, just like all the others, I was very much looking forward to this one, and I was just glued to my seat, like mouth agasp, when they showed off the original trailer for Super Mario Galaxy. E3 2006, I think. Maybe 2005? 2006? Quote me in the comments and let me know which year it was, but even so, what an incredible game Super Mario Galaxy is. It literally flipped the classic Mario formula on its head with all of the gravity-defying level designs, and I actually really enjoyed the much more linear levels compared to the more open-ended worlds of 64 and Sunshine. And this was surprisingly a Mario game with quite a deep and involved story as well. I loved all of the storybook scenes in this, and it really gave the game a nice sense of atmosphere too. And the soundtrack was just on a completely other level compared to the other Mario games. As much as I loved the music in Sunshine and 64, the fact that this was done with a full orchestral score just blew my mind when I got this game, and this is easily one of my favourite Mario games, so this is definitely going in the S rank. And now for the follow-up, which is of course Super Mario Galaxy 2. And this was really interesting because this was the first time that a 3D Mario game had actually had a direct sequel, and I loved the first one so much. I was so excited to see what they would do with this, and I was not disappointed. I feel like the level designs and just the crazy, over-the-top different power-ups that you can get in this game just make it so much fun, and obviously the inclusion of Yoshi as well. And I actually preferred the linear structure of this one as well with the map screen. There were a few things that I wasn't quite as happy about compared to the first one. It definitely is missing some of the atmosphere of the first game, but I feel like it more than makes up for it in the gameplay department, and once again the music is just absolutely phenomenal as well. And I also really loved 100% completing this one as well. Some of those challenges towards the end of the game are just so incredibly difficult, and that's what I personally look for in a Mario game. I love it when they go the extra mile to make it really challenging for fans of the series, and the final level in this game alone took me about 100 attempts, and I finally managed to get through it, and that was one of my favourite moments in gaming in general. I just remember being so ecstatic when I'd finally managed to finish that game. And this is quite a funny version here. This is the version that came with a DVD that explains how to play the game, so that's something kind of weird. So here's the disc that it came with. It's probably not going to focus too well, but yeah. It basically explains how to play a Mario game, like even from the really simple things of like press A to jump and then use the analog stick to move Mario around. Like, surely you could figure that out without having to put a DVD in something that's not the Wii to figure that out for yourself. So Mario Galaxy 2 is definitely going in the S rank for me as well, and it's such a shame that they've never gone back and revisited this game. I was really hoping it would get a re-release on the Switch, so more people could enjoy the really inventive levels that this game has. Now, next up is Super Mario 3D Land for the 3DS, and again, of course, I was excited to get it, but kind of less so compared to most of the other games. I didn't really like the art direction that this game went in. It all felt kind of sterile, and that is kind of true of this era of Nintendo in general. And I also feel like the game is maybe leaning a bit more towards being kid-friendly, which I know it always has been, but it never really felt like it was until this point, so I'm not really a massive fan of 3D World actually. It's incredibly easy to get through, and it's even more linear than any of the other 3D Mario games. Not that I really mind that, but I just felt like I was just mindlessly playing through the games. It definitely had some interesting ideas, and I like the fact that they brought back Tanuki Suit Mario. Even though you can't actually properly fly in this game, it was still cool to see it again, and it's a nice little nostalgic nod to fans of Mario 3 like myself. But even so, this is probably my least favourite 3D Mario game. I did enjoy after you've completed the main game that you could go back and do a harder mode where you had new levels to experience and more difficulty, but having to complete the entire game first and then get to that point did feel like kind of a slog, because I don't really recall dying at all in my entire playthrough. And then compare that to Mario Galaxy 2, which had just come out before it, which was, for the most part, a really hardcore Mario platformer, which I really enjoyed from a difficulty point of view, and then coming to this one just felt like a sort of mindless, thrown together mashup of previous Mario games with a sort of side-on perspective. I will say I really liked the 3D aspect of the game. I feel like with the 3D slider turned up, the way it popped out was really cool, and it looked really nice, and the animations were really smooth, but it definitely has that 2010s Mario kind of downgrade in terms of aesthetics, in my opinion. It feels very sterile, and it's something that Nintendo has addressed now, and it was also true for the new Super Mario Bros. Games as well, so I'm glad that they've kind of gone away from this really sterile, generic looking kind of basic renders of Mario into something a little bit more cartoony and a little bit more, how would you say it, kind of more fun aesthetic. So I'm actually going to give Mario 3D Land a C. And now for the Wii U follow-up to Mario 3D Land, this is Mario 3D World, which I actually enjoy a lot more than 3D Land. And before we get into the game itself, just have a look at this really cool special edition that I got for the game on day one. And yes, he does actually have a fluffy belly as well, which is really fun. So there you go, I'll cover my face up so it can focus on the game. And there's the game inside, really nice and colourful artwork for this game as well. And this was a breath of fresh air, honestly. It took everything I liked about 3D Land and just made everything so much better. I really, really love this game. The new catsuit power-up was so much fun to play as well. Again, it does feel very, very kid-friendly or family-friendly, which again Mario has always been, but even more so in these two entries. Although I feel like this one is a little bit less generic than the 3DS game, and the levels were much grander in scope as well, and I really enjoyed the challenge of this game too, especially going back and completing the game with every single character and touching the top of every single one of the flagpoles in order to get to that super difficult final level, which was just as much fun to play through as the one in Galaxy 2, so I really enjoyed my time with this one. I will say there was a few things that annoyed me a little bit about the game. I really didn't like the fact that there was no overall theme for all of the different worlds. Like, you would go to a world and you would see the theme in the overworld, but when you went into a level, they were all just generic blocks that were just thrown around with no rhyme or reason, really. There wasn't really specific set themes like there was for some of the previous Mario games, which I felt like was kind of an oversight on the design side of things. But even so, I'm definitely going to give this one a B, I think. It's not quite up there with Sunshine and 64, but it's definitely a lot better than the DS game that came before it. And now we're into the Switch era, and obviously the main 3D Mario game for the Switch is Super Mario Odyssey. And this one is kind of an oddity, in a way. It feels like a throwback to Mario 64, but in the same way it also feels like a more generic open world game than a Mario game in some respects. I really appreciate it from the variety point of view. There's so much to do in this game, and there's so many completely out there zany ideas with the hat and stuff, and they definitely scrapped anything that felt generic from the generation beforehand, so I really appreciate it from that point of view. But from a Mario point of view, I was actually very let down with the lack of actual platforming in this game, and I also didn't really like the fact that a lot of the collectibles are just scattered randomly around the levels. I actually much prefer the structured approach of Sunshine and 64 over something like this where you can just explore the levels and find them in whatever order you want, and there's just way too many of them, they're just everywhere, so it kind of dilutes the joy of actually discovering one of them in the first place. And some of them are kind of esoteric and kind of awkward to actually figure out how to get without looking it up online as well, which kind of goes back to the blue coins in Sunshine, but some of these are even more weird. But I just really loved all the transformations and things, but I don't know, I'm kind of conflicted about this one, because on one hand, I really enjoyed what they were going for with this game, but on the other hand, as a Mario game itself, it really let me down in a lot of aspects. A lot of the open worlds were just kind of flat, and there was barely any platforming challenges, which is something I loved about the earlier 3D games, well, all of the 3D games, but especially 3D World and Sunshine with its special stages. They were just immaculate representations of the movement of Mario, whereas in this game it really doesn't matter what you do unless you're just doing it for fun, like jumping off the hat and swinging around and doing all these crazy stunts and things, but there's no actually need to do any of that in the game. So I think I'm going to give this one a B as well, and that might be a little bit controversial, so let me know what you think down in the comments below. And I've got two more Switch Mario 3D games. Let's begin with 3D World and Bowser's Fury. Of course, I already talked about 3D World, and I will say that's fantastic. So let's just touch on Bowser's Fury as well. This is, I think, a much better way of doing an open world Mario game than Mario Odyssey was, and I would love to see Nintendo try and expand on the concept of Bowser's Fury and turn it into a full, proper game of its own in the future. I love the fact that it's open, in the fact that you can actually choose where to attempt these challenges, and then you get to them, and they are proper platforming challenges, which is what I love from a 3D Mario game. It really felt like a culmination of everything that I love about Mario. So I'm actually going to give this one an A rank, which is actually slightly higher than both of those other games. And I haven't actually fully completed the 3D World aspect of it on the Switch, so I might go back and do that soon. Super Mario 3D All-Stars, which is, in a lot of respects, a very disappointing collection, despite it being a collection of 3 of the best Mario games that have ever been made. All 3 of these, Switch versions in particular, have massive problems that make me rank it a lot less than all of the individual games. Let's start with Mario 64. So the main thing that's wrong with Mario 64 on the Switch, and this also applies to the Switch Online version too, is they completely messed up the controls. I've seen a lot of people complaining online about how Mario 64 doesn't hold up today, how the controls don't feel responsive, how people just really struggle to understand how people enjoyed this game in the first place. Well, let me tell you that it's all down to the Switch controller. If you play Mario 64 on an actual Nintendo 64 using the N64 analog stick, the game feels fantastic. It was designed around an analog stick that has a lot more travel and is also a lot stiffer to push in either direction, whereas if you play it on the Switch with a much smaller analog stick that barely has any dead zone and it just goes from 0 to 100, Mario actually feels really slippery to control, which he didn't actually do in the original, because it felt like you had a much more grounded control of Mario himself. So it is really difficult to play Mario 64 on the Switch, and I'm really upset for people who have played that as their first experience of Mario 64, because it really doesn't give a proper representation of what that game's all about. And as well as that, the increased resolution of the Switch version actually shows a lot of issues that you can't notice when you're actually playing the game at native resolution. So there's a method in games where things in the distance get loaded at lower detail is called a level of detail, and it's basically a way of saving resources on the original games. Because on the N64 you couldn't actually render that many polygons at once, so rendering things in the distance at a lower polygon count made perfect sense, and you could barely pick it up because of the low 240p resolution. But playing it in 720p, it is immediately apparent that as soon as Mario gets a certain distance away from the camera, he basically loses all of his detail, and it's the same for all of the enemies in the game too, and it really throws me off. I really don't like seeing that at all, so I wish they would have I wish they would have improved it slightly, and I also wish they would have added widescreen support as well. It does feel very strange to be playing it on the Switch and still be playing it in 4x3, considering what could be possible and what already is possible with emulators. And then Mario Sunshine, and I kind of touched on this earlier, the issue with the controls once again. It just doesn't feel right on the Switch as well, and they actually reversed the direction of the camera stick too, which also completely threw me off. And the controls in general make it a lot more difficult to play Sunshine on the Switch compared to on the GameCube as well. Although the up in resolution does actually make this one a lot nicer to play, so I'll kind of give it points for that. And finally, Mario Galaxy, again, suffers because of the controls. So on the Wii, of course, you would have the Wii Remote and the Nunchuck, and it just felt natural to point the Wii Remote at the screen as you're playing, to pick up all of the star bits, and to swing Mario around with these little blue things that you would swing on, and, you know, you've played Mario Galaxy, I'm sure, but on the Switch, it's really awkward. You either turn on gyro controls and you have to try and move the pointer using the whole system, or you have to use the touchscreen, and none of it really feels right, and it really does slow down the pace a lot. Because one of the joys of playing Galaxy was just moving the remote around and picking up all of the star bits, and it just kind of feels like a chore in this version of the game. So I'm actually going to give this, despite them being 3 great games, the lowest rank on this tier list, and that is a D. So that is it for all of the 3D Mario games. Let me know your thoughts and opinions down in the comments below, and I really can't wait to see what Nintendo has in store for Mario in the future on the Switch 2, which is, fingers crossed, coming out next year. I can't wait to see what they do next. Anyway, thank you so much for checking out this physical tier list, and if you want to see the first one I did for all the 2D Mario games, then click up here and watch that video next. Thank you all so much for watching. Goodbye.